Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and today in this video here we have 5 men's shirt upcycles. We're going to take what's no longer worn and transform it into a garment that will fit you. Each of these upcycles is also marked with a timestamp for your convenience, and you can find them in the description of this video. Also, in each one of these, we're going to discuss one particular skill that is really going to make the difference in how the garment feels, looks, and wears, not only for these upcycles, but also for your future upcycles as well. So in this first one, we are going to rework the armhole and draft a completely new sleeve. Further, we are going to take a look at how to shift the button placket to the correct side of the garment for women's wear. Then, of course, darts and dart alternatives, and what you will need to know in order to take a shirt and then transform it into a garment for the bottom half of your body, like for example a skirt or shorts. I really want to encourage you to look beyond what you see as the final result, let's say color or design elements, because not everything is going to be your style, and that's normal. But in each one of these, I really try to pour my heart out and pour my knowledge out so that way you can get the best result. So in this first upcycle, we are going to explore how to take a men's shirt that's a little bit bigger than your own size and then transform it into a fitted shirt for you. So I just wanted to let you know that it probably isn't going to be the quickest upcycle out there, but it is pretty simple and straightforward. It just requires a little bit of thought and a little bit of process because there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to a shirt. So of course, I'll guide you step by step. I'll explain the logics behind what I do and what decisions that I make so we can take this and turn it into something like this. Now that you can see the final result, we have the goal in mind and the direction that we need to move, so let's get started. When starting any upcycles, first I try to understand the garment that I'm going to be working with, because that is going to set up the whole scene, how little or how many adjustments I'm going to need to do, and also the difficulty of these adjustments, which in return will give you a very clear idea of what is waiting for you ahead. As you can see, the sleeves are quite long and wide, so the cuff is definitely going to need some work. Then of course I have some extra width and extra length in the body. But the most important part that I was paying attention to is the fit of the neckline and the collar itself, because that is quite a difficult part to construct in a shirt. So the fact that it fits means that I don't have to finagle around with it at all. Now if yours doesn't fit, of course, you can cut it off completely and do some other really fun and interesting neckline, but in my case, this is great. We're gonna leave it as is. Before doing any markings or anything else, I'm going to start by unpicking the bust pocket and both of the sleeves. Now when it comes to the bust pocket, you don't necessarily have to unpick it, but in my case it does sit a little awkwardly right now on my body. Now when you do unpick the pocket, be aware that it presents another challenge, because most of the times you can clearly see the stitching line once the pocket is off. Now in my previous upcycles, I'm sure you have seen me use 2 techniques when it comes to undoing the seams. One, of course, is just using scissors and cutting it all apart, and the other one is what I'm doing here, which is unpicking the stitching. Now each one of them has benefits. The first one is great if you have a shirt or any other garment that's way bigger, and cutting does save a little bit of time. But if you're working with a garment that's just a little bit bigger than your size, unpicking the seams really helps, because then you have the seam allowance, which means that you have a little bit of extra fabric to work with. Alright, so the pocket is off, so are both of the sleeves. Now I'm going to take the body and I'm going to put it on myself so that way I can mark those first adjustments. Now here's a quick tip for this next step. If you're wearing a shirt or a garment where you like the placement of the shoulder, this is going to be a great help. However, try to not to wear anything that's super thick or super bulky. Let's say for example a really puffy sweater, because it is such a big garment, it might sway some of the other measurements of the project that you're working on. I'm going to put this on myself, and first I'm going to make sure that it sits nice and neat and not all bunched up. And this is what we have so far. Then with my fingers, I'm going to try to feel the seam of the sleeve of the garment that I'm wearing underneath. And then with a piece of chalk, I'm going to mark that on a purple shirt. Next, I'm going to pinch in the side seam. Now, this doesn't have to be even at all. All I need is that approximate marker that, this is by how much I need to take in the side seam, so that way the shirt fits the way I want it to. Now, I'm going to be doing this on one side only, but if you're not sure, repeat the same process on the other side seam. Just remember, both side seams have to be taken in the same amount. Here I've decided that it's going to be a little bit easier to see if I actually let the side seam out, so that's what I did next. After that, let's go ahead and mark the new side seam. Now, a quick tip for those who have patterns and who sew from scratch: if you do have a button-up shirt pattern, or let's say other button-up blouse, or it doesn't necessarily even have to be a button-up blouse. So if you have a pattern that you've made before that you know fits really well, then you can surely use those pattern pieces in order to transform this shirt. That will definitely take a lot of the guesswork out of this process. I placed my garment nice and flat on the table, and then simply took my measuring tape and measured the distance between the original side seam and the pin that I have placed earlier. Then I took that measurement and I copied it on the opposite side seam. Now keep in mind that these measurements might be different depending on where exactly you are placing them. So for example, you might take in 2 inches around the bust, but only 1 inch around the hip area, which is a little bit lower down the side seam. Next, I pinned both of the side seams according to these measurements and put the garment back on me. And here I've decided that, you know what, I want a little bit of room around my hips, so I made necessary adjustments. I took the shirt off, and here you see the adjusted side seam. Let me show you. This was the side seam that we marked before, and the pins are marking the new side seam. Right now we're going to be working with one side only, and all of the adjustments that we're going to do on one side we will then copy on the other side. So now let's go ahead and talk about the armhole. I'm going to take a piece of drafting paper and I'm going to unpin a couple of pins here at the top, so that way I can go ahead and slide it in. First though, I want to make sure that I fold it in like so to adjust for the shoulder slope. Now that that is in, I can go ahead and take my water-soluble marker, in your case that could be a pencil, and go ahead and trace the outline of the armhole as it currently is. Once done, also mark the position of the new side seam. Let's go ahead and take it out. Now we need to measure from the edge of the shoulder all the way to where we made our first marking. So in this case, it's about 1.5 inches. So I'm going to place my measuring tape right over here at 1.5 inches and make a mark. Then I'm going to make sure to draw in the original side seam, which is in this case straight, and the new side seam, which starts off straight and then of course curves, but at this very point both of these are parallel. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I will place it at this marking. I want to place it in a way that is going to be parallel to the center front, so to the button placket, because usually that's straight, or in this case it is also going to be parallel to the side seam. So I've placed it like so, and then I want to take another ruler, but you can also do it in 2 or 3 steps, you don't have to have 2 rulers, and place it like so, so that way it goes through the marking of the new side seam. As you can see, we have created a right angle, so we can go ahead and outline that in pencil first. Now from this corner at the 45-degree angle, let's go ahead and take about 3/4 of an inch and make a marking. Now that is very, very approximate, but this will do in this case. You can always take less or more. And then also very approximately, let's go ahead and measure this line that we just made and divide it in half. From this mark, we can take, let's say, about 1/2 inch in this case. It's not a super fitted shirt because we're upcycling, so let's do 1/2 inch, and you can always play around with this measurement as well. So now we need to connect this point and this point, and you can do that with a sort of like a straight line, and then we're going to curve it in a little bit more. So we're connecting it first, and then we're going to connect this point and this point. And then this point and the new side seam. Now over here you can see that it doesn't end up straight, it is a little bit curved. So let's go ahead and repeat the same. And our goal is to make sure that the armhole is nice and smooth. So if at one point you need to take it a little bit away from the given measurements that we have taken, absolutely do that. Now I'm going to cut away paper along this new line. Bring in the shirt. I'm going to make sure that I align this old line with the old armhole. If you go with your finger like this, you can feel the edge of the fabric. Here I've miscalculated the position of the shoulder a little bit, but it's all right. We can finagle that here in a little bit. So now that I have placed it on top of my shirt, I can go ahead and I can grab my marking tool and I can make the outline of the new armhole. And here where I have miscalculated this little part, I'm just going to bring in like this. There we go. And here's our new front armhole. As you can see from the original armholes, the front and the back are different. Now in my case, we're going to make the back just a little bit straighter of the line that we have here in the front. So first, I actually need to cut this. But because this line only represents the stitch line, I actually need to cut about 3/8 of an inch away from it so that way I leave the space for seam allowance. As you can see, I have only cut through one layer, which is the front of the shirt. Now from here on the bottom, I'm going to take the same curve, and this time it's going to be with the seam allowance because that's what we're outlining. So very similar curve, same curve, right over here on the bottom. And then over here, we're going to make it a little bit straighter, so not as curved. Now at this point, I think some of you might be asking, well, why didn't you just eyeball the new armhole, because they kind of look a little bit similar, and be done with that instead of doing all of these extra steps? And I'm here to tell you that you can totally eyeball and you can totally do the way that you see fit for your particular project. In my case, from my personal experience, I do like to take some extra steps, at least in order to not to forget your seam allowances, because when you are upcycling, it is different than when you're sewing a garment from scratch. So I've been in the situations when I have forgotten to add that seam allowance because you're just in the mix of so many moving parts over here. So when I do this, it reminds me that, add your seam allowances. Speaking of which, I add 3/8 of an inch, but in your case, if you want to do French seams or any other seams, you might want to add a little bit more because of course the construction of the seam there is going to be different. So in my case, I like to have a little bit more context and a little bit more points of reference because not only we have to take care of the armhole, we also have the sleeve to work with. Plus, it might seem like I have quite a big garment over here, but I actually don't really have much fabric to work with in case if I make a mistake. This is a shirt size M. This is actually my husband's dress shirt, and I usually wear size S or M. So yes, there is quite a bit of width that I took out of the side seam, but there's not a ton of fabric to work with. And I just wanted to give you my perspective. And as always, take from these videos what works for you and figure out the rest. From here, I'm also going to cut the side seams. Again, we need to cut a little bit away from the original marking so that way we allow for the seam allowances. Now let's go ahead and pin the side seam completely. And what I want to check for is I want to place my armhole opened up, and I want to make sure that there's no bumps and lumps over here, and then the entire line is nice and smooth. And as you can see right over here, we gotta tidy it up a little bit. There we go. You want to make sure that this area is nice and smooth as well. So this is the side that hasn't been cut just yet, and I'm going to place it over the side that we have already altered. And we're going to find the center front and we're going to find the center back. In this case, I'm using a shoulder seam and of course the bottom of the yoke seam as a marker for myself to align to make sure that I'm on the right track. After I have adjusted all of the sides, the front and the back of the shirt, once again, I'm going to pin the side seams and put the garment on myself. Now you don't have to do that, but I just wanted to demonstrate what do we have before we move on to the next step. If you're happy with your side seam, now is the time to sew it all together. I'm going to be doing that with a straight stitch from the top all the way to the bottom. And after that, I'm going to finish it with a serger. Now don't worry if you don't have a serger. Use a tightly spaced zigzag stitch on your sewing machine or an overcast stitch if you have one. When sewing, of course, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And once I'm done with both the straight stitch and the serger, I'm going to give the seam a really good press. Now when doing that, don't forget to check the fiber content of your garment because some fabrics don't take heat very well, so be mindful of that. Now, before we do move on to the sleeves, which is one of the last and final steps, let's talk very quickly about a bust dart. There are multiple ways how you can form a bust dart and even add it to a garment. One of my favorite ways is to do it from the front armhole. This is actually how I draft a bodice block with a dart. Now, if I put this garment right now as it is on myself, you will see that there's a little bit of excess right over here. So if you pinch it almost all the way up to your bust apex, that will be your dart. The bigger the bust, the bigger is going to be the dart. Now that dart isn't usually left in the front armhole. Instead, it is rotated into the side seam or in some other areas in a garment, depending on what is the design and a lot of different other things. So in my case, because I do have a small bust and I can get away without a bust dart, and even if you have a large bust, you can get away without a bust dart as well. But the larger is the bust, the more excess fabric you're going to have in this area. So in my case, I'm going to skip adding a bust dart, but if you would like to add the bust dart, I do have the tutorial on how to do that and how to rotate that then into a side seam. And do that before you cut off the extra fabric from the side seam, because you will need that extra in order to be able to form that dart. As for the sleeves, I think I have 3 options that I can play around with, and I want to share all 3 of them with you so that way you can see what's possible. So the first one, and probably the simplest one, would be to take a sleeve, determine the amount by which you need to shorten it, and shorten it from here. So not from the cuff, but shorten it from the top of the sleeve and leave the cuff as is. Now in my case, the cuff is too wide, but let's say you only wear your shirt all rolled up in the sleeve, then this would really work, because then you don't really have to do anything to the cuff. The second option would be nearly the same, but it would require for you to take the entire cuff off, and then you will need to decrease the width of the sleeve by making an extra little pleat over here, and also rework the cuff so that way now it fits your wrist. That one is definitely more involved, and if you've never made a cuff for a sleeve, it might be a little bit challenging, so definitely think about that. Now you can see that in option number 1 and in option number 2, the width of the sleeve right over here around your bicep is quite wide, and not everybody might like that. So in option number 3, we will actually reduce a little bit of that width by bringing the sleeve all the way up. So now the cuff isn't going to be sitting at the wrist, but it's actually going to be sitting quite higher, making your sleeve a 3/4 of a sleeve. This way I don't have to finagle with the cuff, and the width of the sleeve at the bicep is a little bit smaller. Now of course another option is to decrease the width of the sleeve from the sleeve seam right over here, but in my case I don't want to touch that seam, so I think I'm gonna go with the option number 3. Let's start by taking the sleeve and folding it in such a way that this part divides the sleeve in half, and on the other side we will have a seam. Usually that's what's going to happen. You might have a sleeve that's a little bit different, but that's the essence. Now, while I was trying all of these sleeve options out, I have marked for myself that for the third option, I would like the top of the sleeve to be right over here. So before, this part would go over here, but now I need to shorten the sleeve from the top so that way this part would go like so into the armhole. The thing about the armhole and the sleeve is that they always work together, and one really depends on the other. To redraft the sleeve, first I'm going to measure the entire armhole. For that, take your garment and your measuring tape and very carefully measure the entire armhole on the seam line, so a little bit away from the seam allowance. Or you can also measure that little draft for the armhole that we did when we were reworking it. Here, this armhole is almost 21 inches. Now, on average, the cap height, this measurement right over here, so if you place a straight line before the curve of the sleeve starts, this measurement right over here on average equals 1/3 of the entire length of the armhole. So let's say I have the full 21 inches, then I would divide it by 3 and I would get 7. So from this point right over here where I want my new sleeve to start, I would measure down 7 inches and make another marking. Now in my case, I'm going to take it a little bit smaller, let's say about 6.5 inches. There we go. Now we have two things of the equation that we know. We know the width of the bicep because we can't really change it, and we also know the cap height. So the width of the bicep right over here is 7.5 inches, and I want to take a piece of drafting paper and we're going to reflect that on here. Place 7.5 inches in a straight line on one side and 7.5 inches continuing on the other side. Like this, because we have two sides of the sleeve, this one and the other one. So 7.5 and 7.5. Then we're going to take this cap height measurement and we're going to reflect that on here as well. So in this case, it's 6.5 inches. Now I want to connect these points and make a triangle. Then take these lines and divide it in half, and then divide each side in half again. I'm going to repeat the same steps on the other side. Next, I have marked the following. From this point towards the inside of the triangle, I marked 3/8 of an inch. I left this point as is. From this point up, I took 3/4 of an inch. From this point up, I took 5/8 of an inch. From this point up, 1/4 of an inch. And from this point down towards the inside of the triangle, I took 1/2 an inch. Now I'm going to connect these points with a curved line in order to create a sleeve. That's what I have as right now. This one is front and this one is back. Usually the front has a little bit more scoop right here. Now because the sleeve and the armhole work together, I actually have to measure both of them and compare. So let's go ahead and start with the front. I'm going to flip it this way. So first I'm going to measure this curve and then I'm going to compare it to this measurement up to here of the front armhole. For me, this curve of the front of the sleeve measures 10 inches and 1/4. The front armhole measures 9 inches and 3/4. Now let's do the same with the back armhole. I have a very similar story for the back of the sleeve. It measures 10.5 inches, but the front and the back armhole are nearly identical at 9 3/4 of an inches. So the sleeve is bigger than the armhole, which is usually very normal because we have to have extra ease in order to ease in the sleeve. But over here, the shoulder seam isn't necessarily a true shoulder seam. It's slightly a drop shoulder, which usually calls for a shorter cap height. One of the ways that I can see we can go about it is to measure 9 3/4 inches on one curve, make a mark, and do exactly the same on the other one and make a mark as well. Here are these markings. Then I'm going to cut this out. I have placed my sleeve on a straight line. I have marked one edge of the sleeve and the other one, and also the middle as well. So as you can see, I have cut it apart because now we're going to collapse it. I'm going to hold these parts with my fingers and I'm going to overlap the cap of the sleeve up until those markings that we made earlier meet. Now I can tape it together. Now the bottom of the sleeve needs to be straight, so I'm going to place my ruler like so, and I'm going to repeat the straight line that's underneath the sleeve. This could be now cut away. Obviously now we have a little bit of an uneven spot right over here, so let's just go ahead and tidy this up. This is the front of the sleeve, so I want to use this part. I'm going to take it and I'm going to align the top with the top over here, like so, and trace it with a chalk. Next, I'll turn the sleeve and I'm going to repeat exactly the same with the back pattern piece. Before cutting out the sleeve, let's go ahead and mark the middle of the sleeve since our front and the back armhole are nearly identical. And when cutting, only cut one layer at a time and don't forget to add for seam allowances. And there's my sleeve, and I'll repeat the same on the other one. Once that is done, now it is time to get the sleeve into the armhole, which is rather easy because we don't have any ease in this, so no extra steps. Right now, we're going to align this marking that we made a little bit earlier, which marks the center of the sleeve, with this marking right over here, which divides the front and the back armhole in half. Then I'm also going to align the side seam with the sleeve of the seam. From here, I'm going to pin everything else, and it should match perfectly because we did double check. From here, I finished the sleeve the same way that I finished the side seam, first with a straight stitch and then with a serger. When it comes to the hem, I simply did a straight line first, and you can leave it as that as well. But I wanted to curve the hem just like the original shirt. So I did the curve on one side first, and then copy that curve to the other side. After that, I finished it with a narrow double fold hem. Step number 1 is to fold in your hem about 1/4 inch in and do a straight stitch. After that, I often like to give it a little trim and a good press before step number 2. Then, simply fold it in one more time and do the final stitch. And here it is, all done and ready to wear. Now, let me share with you a couple of close-ups of the details so that way you can see a little bit better. And first, let's start with a 360, so that way you can see the front and the back of the finished shirt. Then let's take a look at the sleeves, and as you can tell, I haven't had a chance yet to wash the shirt after being done with it, so here are still some of the chalk markings. And speaking of washing, I truly hope for a miracle that after a wash, some of the stitch lines from the previous placement of the pocket are going to soften up a little bit and are not going to be as visible as they are right now, because the previous placement of the pocket was like this. Quite awkward, right? So I actually don't really plan on putting the pocket back because I like it as is. But if the stitch lines are still as visible, I'll definitely need to figure something out how to deal with that. A really big bonus is that you can actually wear the sleeves 2 ways. You can either wear them rolled up like I did, or you can actually wear them cuffed. And when I was planning the length of the shirt, I wanted to make sure that I can wear it both ways, let out and also tucked in. And here's the before and after, so that way we can see all of the work that we have done. Now, months later, in order to cover those stitch lines from the previous pocket placement, I decided to do thread sketching. It is tone on tone, that's what I was going for. I didn't want it to be super visible, but I did want to create something beautiful. It is a very interesting technique that opens up so many possibilities for both sewing from scratch and upcycling, plus adding a little bit of artistic touch to your creations. So if you're interested, I will leave the link in the description. But for right now, let's move on to upcycle number 2. We're going to take a men's button-up shirt that is larger in size than your own, and we're going to transform it into a cute top. It has short sleeves, darts in the back, and also a bias-bound neckline, which is a great solution for a lot of upcycles of this kind. Now, last time I did an upcycle where the sleeve was a tad more complex. It's this purple shirt right over here. But since then, I thought about another option that would work really great for an upcycle of this kind. It's a little simpler, a little bit more straightforward, but it will still give you a good result. So we will walk through different options. As always, I'll guide you step by step and through the decisions that I made and why I made them. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and let's get started. As always, first let's go ahead and put the shirt on ourselves and let's assess what we're working with. Now, this is actually my husband's shirt that he no longer wears, and as you can tell, it's definitely big on me in all of the aspects, you know, starting from the neckline to the sleeves, the length, the width, pretty much everything. And when I started working on an upcycle, I really pay attention to these details because I'm sort of looking for an anchor. I'm looking for a detail or a part of the garment that either fits really well, or perhaps something that I don't want to compromise, something that I don't want to change, or something so unique that I don't want to lose. When I pick that anchor, I start working around it, and that therefore also builds that roadmap of the entire upcycle, just like I did in that purple shirt. My anchor was the neckline because it fits so well. Therefore, I worked around it. Here, it's a little bit of a different situation because nothing really fits. From one point, it gives you a little bit more freedom. From the other perspective, we will need to do a little bit more sewing, a little bit more design work, but it's definitely going to be fun and wearable. First, though, I will start by unpicking the sleeves because most certainly it has to be done. I'm going to start working on the sleeves here in just a moment, but I wanted to point out a couple of extra things. First of all, this shirt is stretched, so there's a little bit of give in the fabric, which can actually work in our favor during this process. Then there is this button placket, which feels like there's no interfacing in it whatsoever. Therefore, after the wash, it looks like this if you don't iron it out, and it's a little bit challenging to do so. So I might need to problem solve that, so that way I don't have this situation position in the future. And then of course we have a bust pocket. If I decide to keep it, it will stay as is. If I decide to relocate that or unpick it, I'll have to think through if the stitching is going to be visible, and if so, what am I going to do about it? Alright, so the pocket is off and there are some stitch marks visible as expected, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as on the purple shirt. And by the way, I wasn't able to get rid of those stitch marks completely on the purple shirt, which does bother me quite a bit. But interestingly, these two shirts are quite different in terms of fabric. In the purple one, the fabric is drapier, a lot gentler. It's also more lightweight than this one. It's also an older shirt. This one is slightly newer. And here the fabric is 98% cotton. It's coarser. It has a little bit of stretch to it. So we'll see if all of those factors will help us out a little bit. One of you suggested to use the tip of your nail and sort of push the fibers back together and see if you can fill in those holes. And it does definitely help. I just see a little bit of shine on top of the fabric that I create by this movement, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right, let's add a little bit of steam to this situation to see if that will help. Sort of fluff up the fibers a little bit. Oh yeah, it's nearly invisible. The sides are definitely almost gone, but the bottom I can still see the shape of the pocket, but I think it's definitely a lot better, so I think I can live with that. Next, I'm going to undo the side seams and we're going to put the shirt on ourselves and taking the sides. All right, the side seams are undone, but before pinning them together, let's go ahead and pin these shoulders because we are going to be creating dolman sleeves or grown-on sleeves, and it only makes sense to make them look a little bit better, sort of tapering them in. Now, you don't have to do that, but I do think that it's going to contribute to a better looking shirt in the end. Now I'm going to pin the side seams. Let's take it off and see what we've got. First, let's go ahead and take care of these shoulders. Here I'm going to take my marking tool and I'm going to mark where I have pinned, and then I will very, very slowly curve it back into the seam that we have here for the front and the yoke of the back. Then I'm going to copy all of these markings on the other side as well. Next, I will need to open up the seam. I also decided to undo the top stitching all the way to the collar and the neckline because I'm probably going to be removing it, so might as well just undo the top stitching and do it fresh once this adjustment is done. Now what I want to do is I want to place the front pattern piece and the yoke right sides together, aligning at the markings. And if needed, you can also give it a really good press in order to straighten out those seam allowances. Then I'm going to pin it. Now we're going to stitch it together. It is definitely a little bit awkward to sew this little part, but the main goal is to create a really smooth transition from the old seam onto the new seam, so that way from the right side of the garment, it doesn't have any lumps or bumps. However, from the wrong side of the garment, we still have all of the seam allowances and raw edges exposed and the second layer of the yoke that is not attached. But we're going to tackle that in a moment. From the right side of the garment, I want to give it a really good press. I'm going to go back to the inside, and first I'm going to trim the seam allowances so that way we reduce a little bit of that bulk. Once that is done, I'm going to take the piece of the yoke that is not attached just yet, and I'm going to fold it in a way that it goes right on top of that stitching line by tucking the seam allowances to the inside. Then I'm going to give it another really good press and pin it all together, but from the right side of the fabric, because that's how we're going to be top stitching it and sandwiching everything together. Since I unpicked all of the original top stitching, now I'm going to do this from the shoulder seam all the way to the neckline. And here, go slow and steady, because not only we want to have a nice top stitching, but we also want to catch the other part of the yoke that's underneath. Once I'm done, I'm going to repeat all of the same steps on the other shoulder as well. Alright, very nice little shoulder slope over here, looking much better. Now let's go ahead and tackle the side seams. I simply evenly pinned both of the side seams and then drew a seam line on one of them. So that way I can pin it from the wrong side of the garment, put it on myself, and see if I need to make any adjustments before I sew it all together. That allowed me to determine that I could probably take in a little bit more at the bust level, which is great news for the type of sleeve that we're doing. Here's how I had my pins previously. Now I want to move them a little bit closer to my bust. So let's zoom in. And here I'm going to come in about 1 inch. So I'm going to mark it like this. And I'm going to curve it in back into the line that I've created previously. And here at my bust level, I want to make a little sleeve, or the beginning of the sleeve to be exact. Next, I tidied up the sleeve by leaving it slightly curved on the top and then mostly straight on the bottom. After that, I cut off anything that's excess. But while doing that, don't forget that you will need to add seam allowances to all of the seams that you're creating. That includes the sleeve and the side seam. Once you have achieved everything that you want on one side of your garment, let's go ahead and copy that to the other side. To sew the side seams, I went for a simple straight stitch and then a serger to finish the raw edges of the fabric. Hem of the shirt was next on my adjustment list, but you can also leave it till the very end. It's totally up to you. The easiest way to go about it is to determine the length, then do a straight line across. Once you cut it off, use the existing hem in order to create that beautiful curve. I'm not going to finish the hem just yet because I still want to add interfacing to the button placket. So now let's move on to the sleeves. I'm going to place it in a way that the seam is going to be on the bottom, and then over here I gave it a little bit of a press. Now here's my shirt, but before I do anything else, I actually want to take the armhole and I want to fold in the seam allowance towards the inside and pin it. So I'm going to do that to the entire armhole. It's just going to make this next step a little bit easier because now I'm going to grab my sleeve and we're going to combine these together. And the way I want to do it is so that the shoulder seam and the sleeve create one continuous straight line. So I'm going to push the sleeve a little bit underneath the shirt itself, and then I'm going to overlap these. Again, I'm paying attention over here so that way it's nice and straight, but I'm also trying to see where the width of the sleeve would match the armhole. And once I find that spot, which is actually here, it's perfect, I'm going to take my marking tool and I'm going to create the new shape of the sleeve. Let me mark the center of the sleeve, and we're also going to mark the top of the armhole. In this case, the front and the back of the sleeve is going to be identical. Now all I have to do is cut it off, but remember that we have to add seam allowances above the line. Now when it comes to the seam allowances, I know that I haven't really given you a very concrete amount and width to go by, and that is simply because there's just a lot of different variables when it comes to the width of your seam allowance, starting with the type of fabric that you're using, and then of course the type of seam that you're going to be constructing. Is it going to be a French seam or a flat felt seam? Because both of those will require wider seam allowances than, for example, just a regular straight stitch finished with a zigzag or a serger like I'm doing in this case. On top of that, when I do upcycles, I'm often limited by the amount of fabric that I have, which is usually not nearly enough to do everything that I want to do. So sometimes you just really have to get a little bit inventive, but as a rule of thumb, I usually go for 3/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch seam allowances, unless I really have to get creative because there's just not a lot to work with. One of the things to keep in mind when you're doing this adjustment in an upcycle is that it's going to shorten your sleeve. So before you do the final adjustment and cut off the sleeve, make sure that you're happy with the length of it, especially if you intend to keep it long. I also wanted to point your attention to the fit of the sleeve, because oftentimes when something is a little bit easier to draft, a little bit easier to sew, in exchange we get something that isn't as precise in the fit, usually a little boxier and a little roomier in the silhouette. And here you can clearly see that in the underarm section. There's a lot more volume over there. This type of sleeve also hangs differently on the body than a traditional regular set-in sleeve. Perhaps it's a little bit more casual, a little bit more roomier, not as fitted, but you can still use the sleeve in a variety of different garments. I've used the sleeve in a jacket, and a hoodie, and a sweater. In fact, I have a full video about drafting this sleeve and the bodice step by step, and there I go into great detail about how you can construct the sleeve, what to pay attention to in the underarm section, so that way you have enough ease over here to move freely, and all of the things that you will need. So I will leave that video for you guys in a description if you want to use it in your future designs. And this type of sleeve also doesn't have any ease in it, so it's really easy to sew it into your armhole. Just align your seam of the sleeve with the side seam, and then align the top of the sleeve with the previous marking on the shoulder that we've made, and then pin everything in and around and finish it with a straight stitch and a serged edge. I also decided to go for a short sleeve since I'm intending to wear the shirt during summertime. Therefore, I did chop off quite a significant amount. Whatever was left, I did turn up to the right side of the garment, then tucked in the seam allowance, which in return created a little cuff. To keep everything in place, I stitched it down with a straight stitch right on the edge. Next, I unpicked the entire neckline. In your case, of course, you don't have to do it, but in my situation, it simply didn't fit. And then, of course, I was on a mission to reinforce that button placket, for which I had to undo stitching around it and then remove the buttons. After that, I simply opened the button placket, reinforced that with a strip of interfacing, and then closed it down by doing all of the steps that I just undid, meaning all the stitching and adding back the buttons. For these next two techniques, I have very detailed tutorials on my channel. Therefore, we're going to go through them right now rather quickly. The first one is going to be the hem. I usually complete hems like that using a narrow double fold hem technique. It is super useful. You can vary it depending on the project. Therefore, if you haven't explored it yet, definitely do it. It's going to serve you really well. Next, I'm going to complete the neckline, and I'm going to start by stabilizing it with narrow strips of interfacing. After that, I'm going to grab whatever fabric I have left and cut bias strips about 2.5 inches wide and in the length a little bit longer than the total length of the neckline. Then I pressed it in half just like you would with any other bias tape, and I applied it to the neckline. This is great because you can also shape bias tape, therefore it sits even better on the neck. And overall, if you're looking for a neat and simple solution in situations like these, this is a great option. And because it's cut on the bias, it adds a little bit more interest if you're working with stripes. Alright, so let's take a look at what do we have so far, and pretty much we're done. At this point you can leave it as is, but I do think that I could benefit from a couple of darts. I don't really think that I need darts up front, but in the back to reduce a little bit of the volume, so that way I can tuck it in, I can wear it untucked, whichever way, and it would still look great. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand straight and I'm going to determine how much volume do I actually want to take out of the back. And I'm going to do that at my waist level, because in this case, the waist is the smallest of the three measurements between the bust, waist, and hips. So I'm going to do that at the waist level. That's where the dart is going to be the biggest on the intake as well. Now, obviously, this is a super simplified method, but nonetheless, it's going to give us that shaping that we're looking for. And then if you'd like, you can use the same steps in order to give your other garments in the wardrobe a little bit more shaping and sort of take them in a little bit. Now, for my next step, I'm going to find my bust apex, and I'm going to do that on the front because it's a little bit hard to do that in the back. You would be doing something like this. And also, the bust apex sort of corresponds to the beginning of the shoulder blade, so we're just going to use that. Now, just to be on the safe side, we can also mark where we have our waist here on the front. Now we're going to take this off and of course draw in our darts and sew them in. First, let's transfer these markings from the front of the shirt onto the back. There they are. Now I'm going to measure how much I have pinned from the pin all the way to the fold of the fabric. I'm only going to measure one side instead of measuring two because we have two darts, therefore it's going to work out perfectly. I'm going to unpin the back, and now I'm going to find the center back of the entire garment. You can of course do that by folding your garment in half, but I prefer to measure the back yoke seam and then divide it in half. And because we're working with stripes, it's going to be super easy to make a straight line. From the straight line that I just did down the center back of our garment, now I'm going to do a perpendicular line just about the waist level that we have marked. I've taken this straight line all the way to the side seam. Now I'm going to take each half and divide it in half. And that is going to be the position of my dart. Now I'm going to determine the length of my dart, and I don't necessarily want to go all the way up to the upper marking, so I'm going to stop about an inch before it. So I'm going to take a straight line up, and then I'm gonna go, let's say about 10 centimeters below the horizontal line that we drew a little bit earlier. There it is. So I have a straight line right over here. Now I know that you can't really see these markings that well, so I will try to do my absolute best in order to make it a little bit better. Now right here at the crossing of these two lines, we are going to take that measurement that we took of the pinched in fabric in the back. In my case, it was 3/4 of an inch. We're going to divide it in half, and we're going to place those measurements on each side of this vertical line. Now we're going to complete the dart. We're going to connect it to the upper part, which will make a triangle, and we're going to do the same on the bottom. Once done, all we have to do is copy it on the other side of the garment and then sew them up. Now you might find it easier if you do all of these dart markings on the inside of the garment instead of on the outside, but it just so happens that my water-soluble marker actually bleeds through the fabric, but just keep that in mind when you're going to be working on your darts. To pin the darts, I usually start in the middle. I take a pin and I insert it through both layers of the fabric right at the markings. Then I bring the fabric together and place the pin through. Then I place one pin at the very top of the dart and one at the very bottom. I do, however, prefer basting the dart together before sewing it. Now you can also apply exactly the same principle in order to form the darts in the front. In that case though, make sure that the vertical line of the dart goes through the bust apex. But as I mentioned, this is a very simplified version, but don't forget, you are totally in control of all of the garments that you draft, sew, upcycle, and create. Therefore, if you try it on, if you feel that, okay, you know what, I would like to bring the darts a little closer together, or perhaps I would like to push them further apart because that is going to look better, then of course, absolutely go for it. You can sew this type of dart two different ways. You can either start in the middle, go up, then start again in the middle and go down, or you can do it all in one go, which is what I'm going to do right now because my dart isn't really that big. Therefore, I'm just gonna start at the top and finish all the way in the bottom. After that, as always, give your darts a really good press, and that's it. Let's take a look at the final result. I think a good part of any successful upcycle is to actually think ahead of what you're going to wear with this new upcycle. In this case, I had two ideas. First, I wanted to create a put together but still quite casual outfit with these wide leg linen pants that I made 2, maybe even 3 years ago. On the other hand, I also wanted to wear the shirt in a more of a sporty way with these summer shorts that I also made. I definitely love a garment that you can wear in multiple ways, and this shirt is going to be perfect for those summer days. I'm sure that you have noticed that my sleeve curls up a little bit. It's still the same sleeve, I simply added one little element. I just wanted to add a little bit extra detail to this garment. All I did is create a rectangle piece of fabric with a buttonhole on one end, then I sewed the other end inside of the sleeve right where the shoulder seam is at. I also added one of the buttons that I cut off from the rest of the garment, and then by simply bringing it all the way around and then buttoning it up, it curls up the sleeve and creates what you see right here. By the way, you can also use this method of adding darts on your upcycled dresses and tunics as well, so that way they fit you a little bit better. Alright, now let's take a look at what we're going to do in this next upcycle. First of all, I've noticed that in comments a lot of you don't like the fact that I leave the button plackets as they are, because in women's wear usually is the other way around. So today I want to offer you a solution how to tackle this area.
With that, I'm also going to rework the neckline. Of course, tackle the sleeve and the side seams because as you can see, the shirt is quite large on me. This is my husband's shirt. Needless to say, he no longer wears it, so he gave it to me so that way I can upcycle it. And I also have a couple of stains here and there. So all in all, this is a good start and we'll see where it takes us. Now let me show you a quick before and after so that way you can see the direction that we're going. And when it comes to getting started, I know that there are 3 things that for sure will need to go. The first one is the sleeve. I need to unpick it from the armhole. The second one is the side seam, and the third one is the bust pocket. So I'm going to start with those. When it comes to materials, it says that this one is 100% cotton. It is non-iron travel collection, and fabric here is indeed very soft, so it isn't as crisp and as stiff as your usual cotton poplin dress shirts that crease very easily. So that means we can opt for a nicer, more fun design that might involve a little bit of gathering, a little bit of something else that is going to look really nice because the fabric allows it. Now, if you decide to remove the bust pocket like I'm doing here, be prepared that the stitch marks don't always disappear, even after the wash, even after fluffing the fibers, so you have to be prepared to problem solve this. Now before we move any further, of course, we have to figure out the button placket. And here I see 3 solutions and you can pick which one you think would be the best for you. The first one is probably the easiest and the simplest, however, not my favorite, but it is an option. And basically you're going to reverse the placement of the buttons and the buttonholes. You're going to sew the existing buttonholes shut, and you're going to remove the buttons from where they are right now. You're going to place those buttons on the old buttonholes, and then on the button placket that is now going to be empty, you're going to make new buttonholes. That's basically it. The second option will involve a few more steps and only works if you are going to get rid of the neckline and if you have a shirt that definitely allows for more fabric to work with. First, start by unpicking or cutting off the neckline. Then, neatly unpick the shoulder seams. Once done, we're going to do a little switcheroo, so to say. You're going to flip the front upside down and then switch sides. Now, needless to say, you will need to copy or draft a new neckline and armhole and then sew in the front pattern pieces back into the shoulder seams. This way, you don't have to do anything extra about the button plackets, you're just switching them in places. Now the third option, of course, would be to completely cut off the existing button plackets and make them from scratch, which is something that I might be doing in this particular situation. When it comes to this next step, you don't have to do it at all because you might have a different shirt. Here I have pleats on each side of the armhole. You might have that one right at the center back or none at all. But over here, when I'm going to be adjusting the armhole, I'm going to be cutting right through them. It's going to be quite awkward. So I just want to get rid of them. Also, right here, I have a little hole. I'm not sure if you can see it. And I am not quite certain that I can repair it in a very invisible fashion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpick this part and take it and flip it upside down and sew it back in, so that way I can take care of this little hole. It's now going to be on the bottom and I will be cutting it off when I'm going to hem my garment. And I'm also going to get rid of these little pleats. Now I'm going to take it and flip it upside down like this. To make sure that I can sew in the bottom part into the yoke, I'm going to take a straight line and then reattach it. But if you have noticed, the original line, the one that we flipped upside down, wasn't actually straight, but it was curved. So let's take a look. You see a curve over here and a curve over here. And that is because these parts hide a little dart that helps in order to shape the armhole better to go over your shoulder blades. In my case, I don't necessarily need it because we're going to be cutting off a good part of the armhole, but sometimes you might need it, especially if you're working on a form-fitting garment. Alright, so the back pattern piece is reassembled, as you can see, so now I can move on to figuring out the front. The challenge here is that I have to get rid of that stain and the stitching around the bust pocket. My first option is to flip the front pattern pieces upside down, as I mentioned before when we talked about the button placket. But due to the stain, I actually can't use the entire length of the front, so I'll have to figure something out. The idea that comes to mind is to make a front yoke to fill in the missing fabric at the top. That, unfortunately, does mean that I can't reuse the existing button plackets, so I'm going to unpick them and cut them off. Please note that I have unpicked the button placket and I'm cutting 3/8 of an inch past the original stitching line in order to save that seam allowance because we will need it in the future. Next, I'm going to make a straight line right above that stain. That is going to be my cutting line, but to be sure, I am first folding it under and then I will try it on my body to see if the amount of usable fabric is long enough for the bottom part of the new shirt. It seems that it's just barely enough, but I don't really have another choice, so let's roll with that. Now I need to find extra fabric within the shirt to make the front yoke, and the plan is to make sleeves on a shorter side anyway, so I'm going to use that to my advantage and I'm going to cut some of the sleeves so that way I can use that fabric for the yoke. Now it does look like I have a pretty good chunk of fabric here that I can work with, but for some reason, and I'm not sure why, but I was hesitating, and then a completely different solution came to mind. So I was thinking, what if I cut off the original part that has the neckline and the armhole and use that as top of the yoke? So here you see me cut it off and then use it as a new yoke. I'm not entirely sure why I haven't thought about this beforehand, but here we are. Regardless of this, I don't think I've ruined any of my plans because I had to cut the sleeves anyway. So fingers crossed, hopefully that's going to be all right. And right now, I think I'm just going to pin everything together, the top part and the bottom part, and I will also pin it into the shoulder seam and I will try it on to see how I like it. Alright, so far I have a front yoke. I might want to bring it up a little bit higher, but I don't think I have enough length to do it. However, over here, since I'm actually putting this over already existing shirt, you can see that the length is just about the same. And this is the shirt that I wear tucked in or untucked. So if you have a shirt which length you like already in your wardrobe, you can put it on and then put your upcycle in the progress on top of it, so that way you can compare. But be mindful that the fit then is going to look a little bit different. Afterwards, definitely try your upcycle in progress on the body itself without any t-shirts or shirts or sweaters underneath. I also want to double check if there's enough fabric right here on the sides, so that way I can create a comfortable side seam with enough room in the garment itself, so that way I can breathe, live, do all sorts of things in it. And it does seem like there's plenty, and there's also plenty of fabric here in the armhole, so that way I can cut a new one. So I just have to decide if I like these proportions or if I want to bring the yoke a little bit higher. That of course brings the hem a little bit higher. I have to think about it, and then we'll be on our way to creating a new front for our shirt. Alright, here's the course of action. First, we're actually going to cut away the seam allowance. Interestingly, the seam allowance here in this shirt are all fused. They're actually glued with interfacing. So the only way to do it is to cut them apart. And then I decided that I do want my yoke to end a little bit higher up. So I'm going to unpin here, and with my marking tool, I'm going to place a new line for the yoke. Then I have to undo this and also make a straight line across. Now I'm going to cut, but not on the line itself, but I'm going to leave for myself about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. On the bottom here, I also need to mark a straight line. I might curve it in later for the hem, but for right now, it's just going to be straight, and it's going to be right above the stain that I can get out. Now I'm going to copy these pattern pieces on the other side so that way they match. Also, to add just a little bit of feminine touch to the shirt, because this particular stripe and color doesn't necessarily scream to me women's shirt, I want to add just the tiniest bit of gathers right over here. I can't really afford too many gathers, but I want to incorporate that somehow, as I mentioned, to add more of that feminine look to this upcycle. To do this, I'm going to take the bottom part of the front of the shirt, select the longest straight stitch, and sew within the seam allowance. After that, pull on one of the threads to create the gathers. And just as a reminder, you don't have to do everything that I'm doing. That's the beauty of the upcycles. It's definitely totally up to you. So if you don't want to replace the button placket, don't. If you don't have stains that you need to work around, then of course you will skip some of the steps. In general, I just want to drive the idea home that you have the power to do whatever you would like and to reimagine these garments to give them a new life. So definitely pick and choose which steps are good for you and then continue with your plan. Next, I'm going to place these right sides together, aligning, making sure that everything is nice and neat, pinning, and then sewing it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch, starting and ending with a back stitch. This is what it looks like when done. From here, we will need to finish the raw edges of the fabric. You can do that on your sewing machine by using a closely spaced zigzag stitch or an overcast stitch, or you can do that on your serger. Now, let me give this a really good press with the seam allowance facing up, because our next step is to top stitch it. Once again, I'm gonna do that with a straight stitch, and remember that in cases like these, slow and steady definitely wins the race. Now, after both sides are done, the next step is to figure out the button placket, and the easiest way to go about it is to copy the one that we just cut off. As you can see, they're not the same, and I personally don't like the white one, so we will go with the one on the left. Now the problem here is that I need to find fabric for it, and for that, let's measure how much in length do I actually need for the button placket, and perhaps I can cut off the bottom of the back pattern piece and use it for it. To figure out the button placket, I'm going to grab the one that I'm going to copy. First, we need to determine the length. That is going to be your center front opening from the very top of the neckline to the bottom hem. That's how long this line is going to be. Then we're going to measure the width. In this case, it's 1 inch. So I'm going to place 1 inch here and then do another straight line. Now there are 2 sides to the button placket, so we need to do 1 inch again. This is going to be the button placket itself, but we also need to add seam allowances. Because I did leave 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the center front, that's exactly what we're going to add on the left and on the right. So now we have seam allowance, button placket, seam allowance, and that's exactly how I'm going to cut it out. Now in this particular case, I'm not necessarily using the paper pattern, I'm just marking it straight on the fabric, but you can do either way, whatever is best for you. plackets are cut, let's give them a good press and then interface them. The easiest way to do it for me is to press the button placket in half because my interfacing is 1 inch wide. Then I apply a strip of interfacing on each side of the crease. That also makes it really easy to press the seam allowance towards the inside of the button placket. Alright, the button placket is all pressed, so now let's attach it to the front pattern piece. Here, place it right sides together with the front and start pinning it right into the crease of the seam allowance of the button placket and matching it with the original stitching line on the front pattern piece, which should match because they're both 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. After that, sew it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance straight stitch with a back stitch at the end and at the beginning. Alright, after you are done stitching down the placket, what we're going to do is place it wrong side up, so with the inside of the garment, and then we're going to fold the seam allowance towards the button placket and then fold the button placket over, tucking in the other seam allowance. So now from the wrong side, everything is going to be nice and tucked in. And the last thing that we will need to do is to top stitch that from the right side of the garment. However, I'm not going to do it just yet because I wanted to show you something. I have this beautiful blue trim. I had it for the longest time. I used it in some of my other projects, and I'm thinking it would look just absolutely gorgeous if I place it right here like that. So in order to do that, I can't top stitch the button placket just yet. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is going to be connecting the front pattern pieces to the back pattern piece and then forming the armhole. To do that, I'm going to take the back pattern piece and the front pattern pieces and place them wrong sides together. Then I'll open up the back yoke, which in this case is made of 2 layers. So I'm going to sandwich the shoulder of the front pattern piece between the 2 layers of the yoke. I will align them and then top stitch them. Because I'm going to be using that blue trim, I decided to do all top stitching from here now with blue thread. Once the top stitching is done, let's go ahead and try it on one more time. Here's my shoulder seam, looking good, sits nice on my body. You can see that the button placket will go like this. Obviously it needs to be finished. Now let's go ahead and bring the side seams together. We want to determine where they will start. So right over here and where they will end. And let's pin these together on both sides to see how it feels. Side seams definitely are going to be okay, so that's great. And at this point, if you would like, you can even leave it as this. When it comes to the sleeves, this would be a drop shoulder, but I do want more of like a regular sleeve. Regular sleeve would sit right here on the edge of the shoulder or a little bit higher as well, depending on the design. So I actually might go a little bit higher because I do want my sleeve to be gathered, and sometimes gathered sleeves sit a little bit better when they sort of roll off your shoulder. And then I'll continue following the curve of my arm, like so, over here underneath your armpit. Usually the sleeve sits about 1 inch below the armpit, but since this is going to be a relaxed sleeve, I'm going to take maybe 2 inches. So make sure that you make that marking, like so, and we're ready to take it off. Let's get that armhole done. So first, here are the markings. I hope that you can see them in white. And next I'm going to unpin the side seam so it's easier for me to work. Since the sleeve is going to be a relaxed gathered sleeve, we don't have to draft armhole extremely precise, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of eyeballing it and not really worrying about it too much. So I'm going to take a straight line from the mark that we made on the side seam, like this, And I'm going to take a straight perpendicular line down from the mark that we made on the shoulder seam. Now I need to create a really nice curved line. For that, I'm going to divide this line in half. For me, this line is 8 inches long, so half is going to be 4. We can take about ½ an inch, sometimes more, sometimes less, but let's say ½ an inch to the side, and that is going to help us to curve it in. So from here, I'm going to curve it in. There we go. It is also very possible that I might need to take some of the side seam in after we cut out the sleeve. So right now, we can go ahead and cut the front armhole only. When you cut, you're not going to be following the actual line. You will need to cut 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, or ½ an inch away from it, depending on what width is your seam allowance. If you're just a little bit scared to cut all of that chunk out, which I totally get, I totally understand, you can start by cutting out a little bit at a time until you arrive at the point where you're happy with your armhole. Just remember, you have to account for the seam allowances that will be necessary in order to put in the sleeve. You can see that I've cut a generous ½ an inch away from it, so that way if needed, I have a margin of error after trying this on. Now here you can see how the new front armhole sits on my body, and I can even fold in the seam allowances to get a better look. As of right now, I can also pinch in the side seam and determine how and where to make that adjustment. This is the new marking that I made for the side seam, so I'm going to fold it in half, mark it like so, and right now, as the armhole is placed, it's actually perfect because it will allow me to mark the back armhole without a problem. The only difference is that here, I don't want to curve it in as much. I actually want to go not necessarily straight, but definitely straighter than the front armhole. As you know, there's always more than one option, and another solution for this would be to take a shirt that you already have in your wardrobe and then copy the curve of the armhole from there. And if you need more of a step-by-step tutorial on how to do that, I have a video where we copied the pattern off of your favorite t-shirt and we go over the curve of the armhole. So definitely take a look. As always, I will leave all necessary links for you guys in the description of this video. To double check if your armhole looks great, go ahead and open this up. This part needs to be smooth, and then when you place side seam to side seam, it should make a really nice smooth transition as well. Right now we also need to adjust the side seam. I'm not gonna take it all the way to my mark, but I'm gonna take about an inch away from it, and I'm going to take a straight line to the hem, like so. Perhaps I'll take 1 inch on the bottom as well because this line is really on the angle, so maybe we'll do something more like this. And then of course I'm going to repeat these adjustments on the back pattern piece as well. After the markings of the new side seams are done, let's cut away the extra. But as always, I'm not cutting right on the line, but about 3/8 of an inch away, which is the width of my seam allowance. Now I can pin the side seam once again and do the final tryout of the armhole. And if everything looks good, then now we have to copy everything that we've done on one side onto the other side. After all side seams have been adjusted, we can start by actually putting them together. Place right sides together, the front and the back, and then sew it with a straight stitch. After that, I'm going to finish the raw edges of the fabric on my serger. Next step would be to give it a really good press, with the seam allowances looking towards the back. Before I can move on to the sleeve, I need to attach the other blue trim, and I simply do it by hand sewing needle and thread. Now, as a reminder, of course, you don't have to add any trims, but sometimes it can add a little special touch to your upcycle. My little trim is attached, so let's talk about the sleeve. The sleeve here is larger than the armhole, which is exactly what I want. And currently it is in exactly the same state as it was when I cut it off, so I haven't adjusted anything just yet. The back and the front armhole here are roughly the same length, so I'm going to find the center of my sleeve. I'm going to mark it, and we're going to align it with the shoulder seam right over here. Right now, I'm going to base this on the longest straight stitch that I have on my sewing machine. First, I'm going to align the seam of the sleeve with the side seam of my blouse and then pin it. I'm going to do the same for the shoulder seam and the marking that we made on the sleeve. Next, I'm going to start gathering the sleeve to fit in the armhole. This is what it looks right now, basted in. And you can see that the hem of the sleeve doesn't hang parallel to the floor. In order to fix that, we gotta pull up the bottom of the sleeve a little bit in the underarm section. In order to make this adjustment on the sleeve itself, I'm going to take a couple of inches down the seam of the sleeve and then freehand a new curve. Over the next few techniques, we will go rather quickly because I have detailed tutorials for all of them. First, finish the hem of the sleeve and then fold it under, creating a casing for the elastic. Then sew in the sleeve with a straight stitch first and then finish the raw edges just like we did throughout this entire project. If you would like, you can fold the seam allowances towards the shoulder and then top stitch them. Now I decided to finish the neckline by adding a ruffle, and there is a full step-by-step members extra video for this particular technique. Finally, let's top stitch the button placket. Fold all seam allowances inside, pin from the right side of the garment, and then top stitch. For the hem, I usually choose narrow double fold technique, which is absolutely great for projects like these. And after completing the final stitches on the hem, here it is, the final result. Now I must say that the final garment did turn out just a tad bit too girly. I wasn't really planning for that. I wanted to add some femininity, some feminine touch to it, but I think there's quite a bit of it right now, but I do love the final result. And I know that sometimes you might watch these upcycles and think to yourself that it's a little bit too complex, or perhaps there's no way that you can do it, but I would encourage you to take a moment and to really believe in yourself, because if I can do it, you can totally do it. And I want to share with you that when I learn something, let's say painting or whatever else, anything that you do with your hands, sometimes I read and watch and then do it time and time and time again until I finally get the result that I want. So it doesn't happen from the first try, which is totally normal. I think sometimes we assume that after watching it once, bam, it's gonna all come together. But sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So I definitely want to encourage you. I would love to share with you that you can wear the sleeve two ways. You can wear it like that, or you can tuck the hem underneath, and then it sort of gives it a bubble effect, which I think I prefer better than this sleeve. But I like both of them. Both are really wearable. Here's a quick glance on the inside of the upcycle. I truly believe that if you want your upcycles to last, you gotta do them well, so that way they serve you and all your hard work just doesn't go away after the first wash. So far, we've done upcycles and all of them have had some sort of a sleeve. This next one is going to be a departure from that. We are gonna go sleeveless, and in that upcycle, we will also talk about the finishes for the armhole and an alternative solution to darts. Here you can see a quick before and after, so that way we have a clear idea of which direction we're going with our sleeveless upcycle. And sometimes it might seem that skipping the sleeve might be the easiest way to go about it, and it's a yes and a no, because there are a couple of very specific moments that we have to take care of in order for your sleeveless upcycle to turn out really good and comfortable. First, let's take a look at the shirt that we're working with. I usually use my husband's old shirts, but this one I did thrift from our local thrift store, and as you can see, it is quite large on me, but I did love the pattern and the color, so I decided to go for it. But for this particular upcycle, you don't necessarily have to go many sizes up in order to be able to make it. So definitely take a look at what you have in your upcycling pile or perhaps in your wardrobe, things that you don't wear, and take it from there. If I button up the collar, you can see that it actually fits quite decently. It is a little bit bigger than I would like it to be, but it's not super big, so perhaps I'm going to leave it as is. But in your case, if you want to rework the collar, or if you want to rework the positioning of the button placket, so to make it in reverse like it would be on lady shirts, then we have gone over that in the previous tutorials, so take a look at them. I will leave them linked in the description of this video. So, our main goal for today is to rework the shoulder and the sleeve area as well as the underarm area, and that's what I'm going to start with by cutting away the sleeve and opening up the side seam. Now, if you're working with a shirt that is quite larger than your own size, then of course you can take a gamble, you can use scissors and just cut everything apart so that way you can speed up the process. But if you are working with a shirt that is just a size bigger, or maybe it is your size shirt, then I would definitely take my time, undo the seams very carefully, because every quarter of an inch, every millimeter counts in order to save that fabric for redesign. And even if you end up cutting some of that away, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Also, here's something extra to keep in mind. If you are working with a shirt that is your size or perhaps close to your size, then leave the side seams intact for right now, because you might not need to do any adjustments to them. You know, there's something interesting about this shirt. It actually doesn't have a bust pocket, which definitely works out in my favor because then I don't have to worry about it. But if you do have a bust pocket, you might need to undo it and take it off in the process. So definitely keep your eye out on that. Right now, I'm going to put this on and we're going to pin the side seams. One side is going to be pinned right now along the original seam, and the other one we will pin and adjust on the body. When you're pinning your shirt on yourself, you might find that your side seams don't match exactly, and that's okay as long as the fit is good. We also want to make sure that the garment is not too tight and you don't take in too much on the sides, because that will cause stress wrinkles. In the underarm section, you want to pin close enough to the body to avoid gaping of the armhole, and you want to pin high enough so that way your undergarments don't show during the wear of your top. Now I'm going to copy these markings on the other side seam. After that, I'm going to baste these right sides together so that way all the extra fabric is on the inside of the garment. And I'm going to try it on one more time to see how the fit looks. And it's not going to give me a 100% accurate picture because the extra fabric is going to be flopping on the inside, giving a little bit of extra volume at the side seams, but it will be close enough. And from there, I can judge if this is great or perhaps I need to adjust the side seam a little bit more. Once I'm done with basting on both sides, I'm going to turn my project right side out and try it on. Overall, I think it's pretty good, and as I'm trying this on, I'm looking for any obvious drag lines, anything that I need to pay attention to. For example, in the back, I do have a little bit of bagging of the fabric, but that can be easily remedied by adding some darts. But other than that, the side seam is looking good, so I think we can move on to the next step, which is going to be marking the armhole. First, I'm going to start by marking where is my bra strap, so that way the armhole goes over it. Now I'm feeling it with my finger and then marking it with heat erasable pen. Now please disregard the other marking that you see. I did make it earlier and it is not correct. I'm going to mark the curve of the front armhole in a similar way, following the outlines of the bra. The line itself doesn't have to be perfect since we will be adjusting it a little bit later. And remember that you can get the armhole curve in at least 3 other different ways. 1, by using an existing garment and then copying that. 2 by using a sewing pattern, and 3 by drafting a new armhole. And all of these methods we've discussed in detail on the channel, so definitely take a look. I have taken the shirt off and now we'll tidy up the armhole. The final result should be a nice smooth curve. Next, I will cut through the front only, leaving about ½ an inch from the line. This will give me not only the seam allowance, but also a little margin for error. The next step after that is to mark the back armhole. In my case, I have a little pleat, but I will be cutting that away, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now, the back armhole's curve usually is less pronounced and straighter than the front since it goes over the shoulder blades, so I am marking it right on the garment. This time I will be cutting right on the marked line since it already includes both the margin for error and my seam allowance. Of course, I will need to try it on one more time, and with all of the extra fabric cut away, you might experience bagging underneath the armpit. If you have a large bust, you can remedy that by making a dart. If you have a smaller bust, you can take in more in the underarm section like I am doing on your screens. Don't forget to pin it or to mark it so that way we know how much we have to take in. Now it is time to make the final markings on the underarm section and the side seam. Here we're going to mark the new placement. I'm going to turn it wrong side out, and I'm going to blend in this new marking into the side seam. Now I did baste this little part, the new marking, and tried it on one more time just to make sure that everything really does fit how I want it. Now it is time to cut, and as always I'm going to be cutting away from the marking line, in this case 3/8 of an inch, which is going to be the width of my seam allowance. Currently, one side seam and one armhole is all done and ready to go, so now I'm going to neatly fold my garment in half and copy all of that on the other side, and then of course cut it out. I'm going to bring the side seams together like so and double check the shape of the underarm section of the sleeve over here. And if it is forming a really sharp corner, we want to widen it just by a tiny bit to make this a really nice smooth curve, almost like an oval. Next, we're going to be working on finishing the armhole and the side seams. This area right over here is prone to stretching out, especially if you're going to be handling it quite a bit. So if in doubt, you can apply a really narrow strip of interfacing on the inside of the garment or stay stitching right on the edge of the armhole. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the side seams. So I'm going to place right sides together. So this is the right side of the back. I'm going to place it with the right side down of the front, like so. And we're going to start by stitching it with a straight stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When doing any seams in this project, don't forget to start and end with back stitching. Once the seam is done, we will need to finish the raw edges of the fabric. You can do that on a serger if you have one, or you can do that with a tightly spaced zigzag stitch or an overcast stitch on your sewing machine like I am doing in this case. Once done, we will repeat all of the same steps on the other side seam as well. In between steps, give your finished seams a good press. Not only it will lead to a nice and crisp result, but also will make your sewing a little bit easier and smoother. Now onto the hem. You can leave the hem as is, but in my case, I want to shorten it. I have tried it on and made a mark of how short I want it to be. Next, I'm going to take this garment, fold it in half, straighten it out, and place it on my table. First, I'm going to make a straight line across perpendicular to the center front, like this. And I'm going to do exactly the same, but this time straight line is going to come from the center back. Now I'm going to repeat the curves of the original hem. Now I'm going to cut it out, as always, stepping away, in this case about 1/2 inch for a hem. The hem is going to be finished with a narrow double fold technique, folding each time about 1/4 inch and then stitching it down with a straight stitch. I have a very detailed video on how to do this hem very neatly, so I will leave it for you guys in the description of this video. Of course, give your hem a really nice press, and then let's get on to one of the last steps, which is going to be finishing the armhole. Here we have a couple of options. Option number 1, you can make a facing, but for that you have to draft an extra pattern piece, or you can finish it with a bias tape. I will go with the bias tape option, for which we will need to cut 2 narrow strips of fabric at a 45-degree angle, which gives them a little bit of flexibility and helps mold them to the curve. Each one of these is about 1 inch wide, and the total length is a little bit longer than the circumference of the armhole. Now I have cut these from white cotton poplin so that way you can see a little bit better, but if I were you, I would use the sleeve that we cut off in order to cut it from the matching fabric. That way it will be nearly invisible. A quick note about this armhole: as you can see, I decided not to cut away more, so it was a good thing that I gave myself a margin of error. Now let's take one of these, and we're going to start a little bit away from the side seam, place it like so, and fold it up like this. You can pin it in place to hold it, and now let's head to the sewing machine to stitch it down all the way around with 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you do this, go slow and steady. Don't stretch the bias tape, but instead gently mold it to the curve of the armhole. When you get to the bottom, snip off the extra, so that way they overlap just by a tiny bit, and then continue stitching. Now we're going to take this bias tape, fold it like so, with the seam allowance facing this way, and we're going to understitch it. We're going to stitch pretty close to the edge all the way around. Here you see how it looks when it's been completed. After that, we will fold the bias tape over the seam allowance, then fold the entire seam allowance down and stitch one more time right on the edge. At this point, your finished armhole is going to look like this. Don't forget to give it a really good press as a final touch. The very last step for me is to address the bagginess in the back. For that, I'm going to pinch in the excess fabric and mark that point. From whatever fabric is left, I will cut out 2 strips of fabric, each about 1.25 inches wide, and I will turn them into ties. You can leave one end of your ties unfinished because it won't be visible. Next, I'm going to make sure that the marks on the back are even and parallel. Then I will take a strap, I will place the unfinished end between my fingers and then pinch it in. And to secure it, I will stitch over it from the inside. When both ties are done, you will have a really neat alternative to darts. And if you do want to do darts, then of course you will find instructions in the previous videos. After all of that, now let's take a look at the final result. Now I must say that I could have scooped out the armhole in these areas even more, but I actually don't really wear sleeveless tops that often. I think for obvious reasons. I have sensitive skin on my shoulders. I always have this really awkward tan. So I'm going to be adding sleeve onto this later on. But right now, as a sleeveless top, I think it turned out pretty well. I haven't added sleeves to it just yet, but it's definitely on my to-do list. So if you'd like to see how I do that,
definitely subscribe to the channel. And now we have one last upcycle, and this time we're going to turn it into something completely different. We are going to turn it into a pair of shorts. As always, I'll guide you through all of my steps, what I do, why I do it. But when it comes to upcycling men's button-up shirt into a garment that goes on the bottom half of your body, like a skirt or a pair of culottes or a pair of shorts, we do run into one particular issue. Usually, depending on a shirt, of course, the fabric just isn't thick enough. So in order to work around it, we will need to pick up some extra fabric for this project. Now, in my case, I just went with medium weight cotton that was available at my local craft store, and that should do it. The shirt itself is also 100% cotton. This is my husband's shirt, size M, and we do have a few signs of wear and tear over here, a couple of little holes, and a few stains going on that I will need to keep in mind. A fun fact for you here, this is actually a button-down shirt and not a button-up shirt because it has two little buttons over here that button down the collar and prevent it from flopping around. Now, before I start working on anything at all, first I have to determine if I have enough fabric, and if I do have some sort of print on my shirt, how often does it repeat? Because as you know, matching prints does take more fabric. Now it looks like over here I have this dark blue dominant stripe that repeats every so often, and in my case I'm not necessarily trying to fit an entire pattern piece in it because I'm okay with piecing it from multiple pieces of fabric. I'm just trying to see if I have enough fabric for the project overall. To make a pair of shorts, of course, you're going to need a pattern. And here we have three simple options. Number one, use a commercial pattern that you already have at home, or of course, you can purchase one as well. Then you can use your favorite ready-to-wear shorts that you've been wearing, you've been loving, you like the fit, and you can copy them and turn them into a pattern. I have a really detailed video that will show you step by step how to copy your favorite pants or pair of shorts and turn them into a pattern. And I will link that video for you guys in the description. And option number three, of course, is to draft your own. As you have guessed, I also have numerous videos on this topic, from drafting culottes to pants, shorts, and many more. I will leave them for you guys in the description as well. My self-drafted pattern for today consists from the front pattern piece with the drafted on zipper fly. Then I also have, of course, the back pattern piece. There we go. A pocket in the front that's going to open up into the waist and the waistband itself. Well, the pattern, as you can see, is really straightforward, but there are a couple of little details that I added or excluded in order to make my life, and hopefully yours as well, a little bit easier, especially when you're upcycling with a very limited amount of fabric and adding on top of that plaids, stripes, or any other geometric print. So first, right here on the back pattern piece, as you can see, I didn't mark a dart. The dart is actually still there, but usually when I place a dart on a geometric print, I try to make sure that it falls in the right position, it looks nice when you actually sew the dart, and that of course takes more fabric and more pattern matching. So in order to avoid all that, instead of sewing an actual dart, I'm going to use gathering technique, and I will gather the top part of my back pattern piece. Now here on the front pattern piece, I decided to do the opening of the pocket into the waistband for a very similar reason. This way I don't have to do the pocket bags from my shirt, but I can actually complete them from a lining fabric because it's going to be covered with a little flap. Now of course I am going to be using fabric on the flap, but I thought that would give me an opportunity to play around with this geometric print and perhaps cut it on the bias, which would just then add a little bit of interest to the entire garment. Now the pattern itself is actually derived from these circle culottes that we drafted together just recently in one of the previous videos, and I decided to conduct a little experiment. I thought, what if I take a circle culotte and then I transform it and adjust it into a straight leg short? And that's exactly what I did. So if you are a member of this channel, there will be a members extra where I'll explain my reasoning, my logical thinking behind it, and why I decided to do this experiment in the first place. So thank you so much for being a member of this channel, and definitely tune in for all of your members perks. Alright, I think I'm ready for the next step, which is going to be taking this entire shirt apart.
here, instead of cutting everything apart, I decided to unpick the seams and preserve the seam allowances. And I know that this is more time consuming, but in my case, I don't really have the luxury of a lot of fabric. Therefore, I'm trying to preserve every little bit that I have. Now it is time to cut my pattern pieces and piece them together if that's necessary. And usually I start with bigger pattern pieces first and the ones that are the most important. And after that, from whatever is left from like fabric scraps, I will cut all of the smaller pattern pieces. Looking at what I have, it seems that I can cut most pattern pieces as is, and then perhaps I'll need to piece just maybe one or two together. And as always, my self-drafted patterns don't include seam or hem allowances, therefore I add them as I cut my fabric. Now, speaking of piecing the fabric, you have to think through in advance which part of the print or the pattern would be the most suitable for it. In my case, I think that one of the darker stripes would probably be the best connection point, and if done right, could be nearly invisible. So as you can see, I have cut two front pattern pieces as they are, one back pattern piece as it is as well, and then the other one I will need to piece together. Now, when it comes to piecing fabric together, there are obviously many ways how to go about it. Sometimes I do prefer starting from the right side of the fabric. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to overlap the fabric pieces where I want to join them, and then I'm going to top stitch them right away using a blue thread to match that blue stripe. Let me bring it to you a little bit closer and show you what we have here. I could have probably picked even better blue color, but that's the only blue thread that I had on hand. My preferred method to finish this all up would be a flat fell seam, because sometimes depending on the fabric and on the thickness of it, if you do finish the raw edges with a zigzag or perhaps a serger, they might show through, or when you go ahead and press the garment, they might leave an imprint on the right side of the fabric. So flat fell seam kind of eliminates a lot of that. And here, I make the flat fell seam as wide as needed in order to be able to, again, stitch into that blue stripe. Once again, I'm going to stitch from the right side of the fabric, as I mentioned, aiming at that blue stripe. And in this particular instance, slow and steady definitely wins the race. Once I have pieced my fabric together, now I will finally cut the full pattern piece out of it. At this point, we can finally start putting this garment together. However, the order of construction and of course the technique is going to depend on what type of pattern you have chosen for your shorts. Because if you decided to go for an elasticated waist, that is going to be very different from my zipper fly, or perhaps you wanted to go for an invisible zipper, or let's say you decided to go a half flat, half elasticated waistband, for all of which I do have nitty-gritty in detail tutorials on my channel, so I will leave them for you guys in the description of this video. And since I can't really cover every single variable, right now I want to give you some really important points of the construction and something to pay attention to. And we're going to start with interfacing. Oftentimes I find that fabric from casual button-up shirts or button-down shirts just doesn't have enough structure, and therefore in order to give it a little bit of structure on the bottom, I'm going to interface the bottom hem and of course the zipper fly area as well. With that, to avoid any extra steps after that and all of that pressing in around, I'm actually going to press the hem right away. After all of the hems were pressed, I actually used my pattern pieces to cut out the lining. Now the next step for me was to finish all of the raw edges of the lining and the main pattern pieces, and I did that with a serger since I'm planning to press all of my seam allowances open, but you can of course do it with the sewing machine without a problem. Now the next step after that is the pocket. This pocket might look a little odd at the first glance, but it is actually exactly the same pocket as in this jacket and as in these pants. Now since these shorts sit a little snug around the waist, I did curve in the opening of the pocket to give me a little bit more room in order to put my hand inside. Now you will find a detailed pocket tutorial underneath this video. Now the flaps are cut on the bias, as I mentioned before, interfaced and backed with lining, and then finished with a bias tape. Let me show you how the finished pocket looks from the inside. Here it is. And from the right side of the garment with the flap already basted in. After the pockets are done comes the general construction, which I usually start with a zipper fly. Once that is done, I actually have to go back to the cutting stage and finish cutting out the waistband, which I decided to do on the bias as well, partially because I thought it would add a nice touch and tie in together those flaps for the pockets that I also cut on the bias. While I was cutting the waistband, I also decided to add back pockets, which was an impromptu decision. I wasn't really planning for it. And because I didn't have enough fabric to cut matching pockets and match the stripes exactly right, I decided to cut them on the bias as well. Here comes a little challenge though. As you know, bias does stretch. Now, in order to prevent stretching out, you can of course interface it like I will do that for the waistband, but for the pockets, it will make them way too stiff. So instead, I decided to line them up with a lightweight piece of cotton cut on a straight grain. I then placed the pockets on the back pattern pieces and attached them with 2 rows of straight stitches. The next few steps after this will be filled with lots of hand basting in order to match the center back seam. And after that, a little bit more pattern matching at the side seams as well as the inseams. The lining of these shorts is constructed exactly the same way, minus the pockets, minus the zipper fly. And once that is done, then it is time to put them all together. Before I move to attaching the waistband, I have to finish up 2 things. First of all, I decided to add some belt loops, so I did sew them up and then I basted them in on my shorts where they need to go. And then I also gathered the back pattern piece to account for the dart intake that I didn't sew up. Now to finish everything off, I completed the waistband, the top stitching, and for the closures, I chose hand-sewn snaps. Alright, with all of that being finally done, let's take a look at the final result. And there you have it. If you want to see more upcycles, I have an entire playlist dedicated just for that. More than 20 projects right over here. So I'll see you in that next video. And until next time, happy thoughtful sewing and upcycling. Bye!